Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And welcome to our webinar on how to passkey, a CISO's perspective. In the next 30 minutes or so, Jonathan and Rishi will share their takes on passkeys as both users and implementers. They will also share tips with organizations looking to implement passkeys, whether in their customers or their workforce. You're welcome to add your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Rishi and Jonathan to take it from here.
Okay, welcome, Jonathan. Great to have you on this
Rishi.
webinar. Great to have you on this webinar. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your role, and what are you excited about these days?
Okay, so I'm the CISO at Lemonade. Lemonade is a full stack insurance company, meaning we build all of our own technology. We underwrite our policies. We're not a white label for another insurance company. And I've been in security since 1997, starting off with identity and access management, even before that was a term in security. I'm doing sysadmin work, and then eventually getting close to hopefully at some point retiring. And right now I'm a CISO at Lemonade, which is the best company I've ever worked for.
Excellent. No, very, very, very nice to have you here. You know what, when we first met, what was most excited about were your passionate views on how to improve identity and access management. So really excited to have you talk about the topic of passkeys. I think for the audience, I'll introduce myself as well. I'm Rishi Bhargava, one of the co-founders of Descope. We are an authentication and user management platform. And I think my role here is to ask some of the questions that we hear from our customers, some of the most common myths that we hear about passkeys and WebAuthn, and try to get Jonathan's perspective. So that's kind of the overview and the agenda for our webinar today. With that, let's quickly get into the first question, which I think is a critical one, which is, Jonathan, what role do you see identity play in enterprise security, and how has it changed over the years?
Well, identity is a central role in enterprise security. Almost everything ties back to the person or machine, because everything needs access. If you do things right, any sort of resource or data or anything you want should go through a whole access protocol. Like, who are you? Do you have permissions for this? What are those permissions? So identity is at the center of it. Over the last 2 decades that I've been in identity, I've seen it evolve from just being an authentication database, like with LDAP, to having basic access control systems like an old program called Integrity, which is probably the first very popular access management service for the web. Of course, before that, there were many other protocols and services that were not internet focused. But it's only gotten more complex with cloud and more important because the value of breaches to attackers has become so high.
I think it's very interesting how you pointed out how the role of identity in security and how attacks are growing. One of the things that I've been hearing is this whole, when we talk to our customers, this whole thing, which is now that the applications are cloud driven, there is no perimeter. Anybody on the internet can access. I think identity almost becomes more of that, the front gate that you need to protect against hackers. So clearly the role is definitely becoming more and more critical.
Yeah, that's right.
I think let's get to the topic. I mean, I would love to hear your take on passwords and contrast them with passkeys, or tell us how you define this whole passkeys / WebAuthn. How would you explain it to people who may not understand the protocol in depth, so to say?
Okay. Well, passkeys are a really important evolution in authentication. Passwords were good for a while. They certainly have outlived their usefulness because there's so many services people access, that we went from having password schemes where people would start on the letter V and they go up all the way to the 4 and then come back down the 5 to the letter N. People would take their spouse's name and add a add a birth date to it and then maybe change it every year. And those schemes now are completely useless. So then we went to password managers, which was a way to manage a collection of passwords you would never have to remember. And that was useful for a while. But ultimately, passwords are phishable, passwords are crackable. It's no longer useful. So we needed something. And passkeys or WebAuthn really is that significant leap forward in authentication. And we could talk about that protocol and how it's done, because there's still there's a misperception about how it works and what it means. And I think those are things to talk about. But the summary of it is it's a significant leap forward in authentication security, and it really is good.
So that's actually a good point. It is significant leap forward. Tell us your experience, and maybe talk to us like, what have you experienced with passkeys, both as you implemented it and the user experience. So what have you seen so far in your real life using passkeys?
So we're just finishing up a full rollout of passkeys at Lemonade. I think we're a bit earlier. We're earlier than most companies, but we're there because it's important. But through this rollout, which has taken a couple of months, I learned that anything that is cognitively very different than what people are used to requires a lot more effort to explain and to get them used to it. It's actually a very simple technology to implement at the individual level, but because cognitively, this idea that you're not typing in a password to people who are used to it feels insecure, which is, of course, the opposite. And that's required a lot of explanation and re-explanation to people about how passkeys work, why they're more secure, why they increase your privacy. Some people are under the misperception that there's actually a privacy concern there. And I hope we can talk about it in this call.
That I think we will get to some of these myths, which is very interesting, right? But I think I want to dig deeper into this comment you made, which is the lack of password, which is a way insecure method compared to passkeys. The lack of that is making people insecure. So tell me more. I think this goes into the human psychology and what we are used to, and how changing this interface is. So, but tell us more, like in your organization, as you rolled out, what kind of, like, did people come in and say, like, how am I authenticating? What is going on? But give us some examples and dig deeper there, please.
Well, if you think about the average worker, say, has been working for 12 years. I'm making that number up, but you know, and for all of her life, she's been entering in passwords into her computer and entering passwords to get to websites. And her mind works that way, which is nobody can get to my account unless they know my password. And suddenly you give her this black button on her computer, and she touches her finger to it, and suddenly her computer is alive. Like, there's a cognitive leap there, because she didn't tell the computer anything. We don't inherently understand how fingerprint readers work, much less facial recognition services or any other biometric. And we haven't used some of them long enough to understand that that's actually more secure. And technology can be magical to people when they don't understand it. And you just think, well, maybe that's not really secure. So yeah, I find that I have to explain to people a lot how the underlying technology works and why it's actually super secure as opposed to a password.
Let's talk about that, because this whole point that you said is like the myths. One of the really common questions. So as we talked to people, tried to educate them, and even these are some of the technical folks, and it's just, as you said, right? Technology can seem magical the first time it comes out. The most common question that I've heard is, if I'm authenticating my users with passkeys, I don't want to get that biometric information, right?
Yeah.
So the biggest challenge that I feel here is, like, everybody assumes that if the users authenticate with biometric, the service which is on the other side gets the biometric information. And probably that's what you're referring to. It's like the one of the myth on how this works. So tell us in your explanation, how did you overcome this education challenge? How did you explain this particular piece?
Okay. Passkeys rely upon standard asymmetric key encryption. So if I'm the consumer and I'm talking to a website, that's the website, I'm going to use a private key, and my public key, which the website will be able to verify that whatever I sign with my private key, it comes from me. Now, the interesting thing about passkeys and why they're more secure is how I unlock my vault to get to my private key. So we're used to unlocking our local vault, which might be a secure enclave on a Mac or a TPM chip on another device. And that's a one-way mechanism. It's a vault that you can only put stuff into, and you can only destroy the stuff in there. You can never extract anything from that vault. And that's something that's verified by third parties and attackers and scientific organizations. So we know that those chips are secure. Instead of unlocking that vault with a password, now I unlock it with a biometric, such as my fingerprint or my face. And that's how it works. The private key is stored locally. It can never leave that. I can only unlock that to do my signature with something that I am, which is my fingerprint or my face right now. And that's it.
Wow, that's actually very good, right? Because I think what the takeaway here, what I'm hearing is that the key thing is biometric never leaves the device. The user is unlocking the private key using the biometric. And I think that helps overall with the privacy concerns that somebody may have.
That's a good way to talk about it. And you could say your device becomes a factor in itself with multi-factor authentication.
Very good point, which makes it even more secure, because now what you're telling me is like nobody can log into that service without having access to the device and then having access to the biometric to unlock the device, which becomes a multi-factor auth in a single login experience.
Just by its nature, yeah. So you've got the secret, which is the passkey. You've got the device, because that passkey is essentially registered just to that device and that browser. So that's your second factor, is the device. Even if you took that passkey, again, there are caveats here, there are footnotes where we could talk about some new developments. But if you took that passkey and put it onto an attacker's device, if somehow an attacker could disgorge that passkey, that device and passkey are not registered with Citibank.
That's actually a good point, because one of the other questions that has come up is, what if somebody steals my device, or what if the passkey is stolen and given to other device? But you're saying you're protected from both of those attack vectors, because if the device is stolen, then the attacker doesn't have my biometric to unlock the device. And if the passkey is to a new device, the device is not registered. So there's protection against both of those.
That's right.
Excellent.
Rishi, it says something I want to go back to, because I think this is something I've encountered with folks in other legal departments. I've seen this. So I'm also an attorney. I did that mid-career and became a privacy attorney.
Wow, I did not know that.
So I've seen this in some of the legal forums that I'm a part of, which is many people in legal, also not understanding how biometric systems work, think that because a work computer is capturing someone's biometric mathematical representation of some part of their body, their face or their finger, and the company owns that computer, that the company somehow can get at that biometric that mathematical representation. But for the reasons I explained before, it's not possible at all to disgorge that information. It doesn't get copied anywhere. So there is no legal risk with in the states where there's in some jurisdictions where there's a requirement that you disclose that you're capturing biometrics or you're not allowed to use them. It's a misunderstanding with many lawyers that somehow they would be in violation if they allowed their employees to use biometrics on the computer. It's not.
Very good point. And thanks for clarifying that, because I think to me, these are all the common objections, as like, why should I not make the leap of faith? But in addition to these myths, I think the other question that has often come up is the whole passkey standard, which I think is being supported and encouraged by Google, Microsoft, and Apple, especially to make it even easier to go cross-device. Like if I registered one device, logged in with one device, if I move to my phone now, and if you want to get to the same site on the phone, makes it much seamless. There is this, I would say, slight concern among people trying to implement passkeys. Is this going to be used as a vendor lock-in? Is the standard open enough? Tell us more. Like, I mean, I know what I have read is the standard is open. Everybody's supporting the standard published by FIDO, but would love to hear your thoughts on your perspective. What are you hearing? What are you seeing from a vendor perspective, as in Google, Microsoft, and Apple?
Yeah, I don't see any additional vendor lock-in than the difficulty would be to change my password if I went to a new service. It's the burden is really low, which means that the lock-in is not really there.
That's fair.
The convenience of working with a vendor and having passkeys work across your 3 or 4 devices is significant. But if I want to go out tomorrow and buy an Android phone, it just takes going to that Citibank site and probably taking 6 or 7 seconds to register a brand new passkey on that phone. And then it's shared to my other Android devices.
Beautiful, very seamless. Let's switch gears. I think you mentioned early on that you recently implemented passkeys at Lemonade. I think other than these myths which you just talked about and how there's misconception, the other side that I want to spend a few minutes on is learning from your experience and tips and best practices on what did it take and what would you recommend our viewers to think about if they are migrating for existing users. Imagine an existing organization, you had users with passwords, moving them to passkeys. Tell us what should people think about? What should they plan? Beyond, of course, there are aspects of technology, but process, tell us your experience as you roll this out.
A few things. First, work with your IT department closely to test out as many of the different use cases that you think you're going to encounter. So for example, if you're a Mac shop primarily, but a lot of your employees have Android phones, don't just test out Mac with an iPhone, but test out how does Mac work if someone has an Android phone. If you're using Android, that usually means that you're going to have a much greater variation in operating system versions, as well as devices. And so you want to test out some of the common problems and make sure you've got a good answer as to how to enroll a particular OS or maybe establish a minimum version. So that's really important. First thing is test out the different use cases you're going to have. Then the next step is to warm people up to the idea of passkeys because it's so new. And I suggest first start talking about passkeys as a new thing in the public. For example, Google has some really great stuff about passkeys, but also it's really easy to have to suggest to your employees, hey, go enroll in a passkey for your own private Gmail account because it's really easy. And here's how you do it. Get people warmed up to the idea. And so you could do that with many services. There's so many companies now that are offering them. I can think of tech companies like GitHub just announced it, I think this week. Yeah. But Google, Apple, Microsoft, they all do it. So warm them up to it from a consumer perspective. PayPal does it. PayPal, yeah. Just think of
Home
any
Depot,
of the big
by
companies.
The way, recently Home Depot, even like not the, you would think technology companies, but Home Depot, where the consumer actually is not the typical high-tech consumer, they also rolled out.
And that's great because people are comfortable with Home Depot, they're comfortable with PayPal, and encourage them to do it because it's more secure. So I would engage over the course of 2 weeks to a month on a communication campaign, periodically telling people about passkeys and success cases. Google's got an interesting paper about how it's much faster when you use passkeys than it is with passwords, ignoring the extra security benefits. And after you've done that, then start, of course, with a small test group at your company. And then widen that as you learn some of the issues. If you're a Slack or a Teams company, you can create in Slack canvases and Teams, I don't know what it's called. But you create a very simple document that's in a channel. And what we did is we added groups of people to a channel to say, now it's your turn. And we provided this canvas, which gave pretty clear instructions. But we also learned that instructions are never going to be clear enough for everybody.
Yes.
Some people read quickly, some people read slowly.
Excellent.
So
communication is critical. I think communication is critical. I think it's a change which people are going through. So that's actually some really good tips. And I'm glad you brought up the Google's stats and blogs. And I think that is a very good example of a company which caters to millions of users or hundreds of millions of users adopting passkeys for both security and speed of onboarding reason. In fact, I think that blog, we'll put it in the notes when we share all of the webinar details with our viewers, because it's actually a good example with some statistics pointing out how use of passkeys affects the onboarding authentication experience for the good and makes it faster, but also how much more secure it becomes over time. So definitely a good call out. And I think it's very interesting. I mean, we are talking about use case where you deployed it for your employees. And I like how you said is like, let people experience on the consumer side, because eventually the passkeys are going on getting adoption on both fronts, which is an app for the customers and then internal employees. And once people get technology exposed on both sides, then of course they're more familiar and easy to onboard. So definitely those are some great tips. You also mentioned education. I think you touched upon the education to the users or who are going to log in. Was there an aspect on education to stakeholders? You touched upon get to know your IT teams, but execs, is there going educating other stakeholders in the company to say, what does this mean? What are the benefits? Is there internal selling to be done there?
I think there can be. Lemonade is a very, very tech forward company. So with my peers and my management, I don't think a lot of education was necessary, but I could see that because everybody, it doesn't matter if you're customer facing or you're in finance or you're the CEO who's working with investors, you still use passwords in your everyday life, and passkeys are going to be new to you. The people who could block you, for example, a CEO with the CEO, if she decides that she's not comfortable with this technology, and could block you, you want to educate her before you roll this out, well before others. So you just have to decide who are the stakeholders who really need to be comfortable with this, and then I would approach those people early on.
Very good. So excellent. I think given the time, we're close to our 30-minute mark. We want to take some time for some for questions from our viewers here. So quick recap, right? So we touched upon a few things, which is what is passkeys, how do they work? We touched upon myths, which I think is very, very critical to understand. It's privacy preserving, the data never leaves the user's device, the services don't know about it. And then the tips. I think I am seeing a couple of questions come in here in the chat. One of the questions that popping up, which is a very, very interesting one, which is this customer is saying, I'm considering passkeys for customer login experience. Any thoughts whether it simplifies the user onboarding experience or does it make it harder for users to onboard? So what are your thoughts on that, Jonathan?
I think for early adopting companies like Home Depot, it probably will complicate things for some users. That will go away soon. I'd say within the next year, as more and more people are comfortable with passkeys. But the way to deal with that is to make sure you have an easy fallback flow. So if somebody doesn't want to use a passkey or doesn't get it, he can immediately say, no, I want to enter a password. So you should make that as easy for your customers as possible. But you also, I think you want to be an early adopter with good security, because the experience with passkeys ultimately for the consumer is just so much better.
That's
It's
actually
just
a very good
so
point.
much better.
Yeah, I think one is the onboarding experience, which I'm glad this user, the viewer brought up, because we touched mostly on the security, given the theme of the webinar. User onboarding, you're right, it's so much better. But also, I think from a customer experience, as we have talked, there is this fraud side, which we didn't touch at all, right? I mean, the benefit of having passkeys, if you're a B2C company, the fraud benefits are amazing, because the majority of the concern there with account takeover, what we have seen is stolen passwords. People log in with stolen passwords, and then you have a big fraud problem at your hand, which, as we touched upon earlier, passkeys could be a multi-factor in itself, tied to the user's device, can help a ton. So thanks for the thoughts on that. The other question that is coming in, which I think is a kind of a related one, is I'm building a new application. Should I start without a password completely? Like, is that going to be okay to have an app with no password, with an OTP or some other identification method tied with passkeys? What are your thoughts?
No. The consumer base just isn't familiar enough with passkeys yet. So no, you want to have a fallback flow that's easy for somebody to go to, because you don't want to see drop off initially. I'm pretty confident that within a year or so, that fallback flow is going to be less necessary. In a few years, passwords will be a thing of the past. So no, right now, absolutely have a fallback, an easy fallback like passwords. OTP, which is really cumbersome, but if people are used to it, sometimes they will choose that. But in short time, you won't have to have that. That's my hope.
That's actually, I mean, that's, I think, what we would all hope. I think the experience, security, everything would get much better. But I think it is indeed a journey, as you said, which is education is a big part of it, is what my takeaway here is. And then I think the big takeaway is this is going to be a huge leap forward from a security and user experience perspective once we start to see the adoption.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Before we close, any last thoughts that you would want to leave our viewers with before we close the webinar?
Yeah. You know, often in technology, when we migrate people over to a new technology, there's a drag. There's a period of time where people are saying, you know, I really want to go back to what I was using before. We've rolled out passkeys at Lemonade. I've not had a single person out of all of our employees come back and say, you know, I think I want to go back to passwords. Is there that option for me? And that's pretty telling. I've never seen that.
That is amazing.
Before.
That is actually very encouraging and telling for the success.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for taking the time out and helping us spread the word here.
Rishi, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.